Hi there, I'm Matt Easton, scholagladiatoria channel. Let's talk about fantasy Warhammers and specifically Gendry's Warhammer from Game of Thrones. Hey folks, so recently, in fact in the last episode aired, we saw Gendry appear and we're really happy to see Gendry back on Game of Thrones. I think for many people who've watched the series from the beginning, he was quite a character we were quite fond of. And of course we know that he is, spoilers coming. So before I get into this video, last time I did a Game of Thrones video, many people complained about spoilers. Don't watch the rest of this video if you don't want any spoilers. In fact, you've probably already been spoiled by this point. But anyway, so for those of you who are up to date, carry on watching this video. We've seen Gendry reappear, and of course many of us were fond of Gendry, and we know, even from the end of the first season, that he is the bastard child or the illegitimate son of Robert Baratheon. Now, Robert Baratheon in the books was famous for using a Warhammer, and not only that, but Gendry himself is of course a skilled armourer and weapon maker. In fact, I'll just do a slight tangent here. Regular viewers of my channel will know that I do many tangents anyway, but generally speaking, in the real world, someone tends to be an armor maker or a weapon maker. They're related, but they're distinct skills, and certainly in historical context, so in the medieval period, for example, you tended to be an armorer or a blade maker. And indeed, even within those, there'd be specializations in terms of what particularly you made. So the name in German Helmschmied, for example, Helmschmied means helmsmith, helmet smith. So in the medieval period, in the 15th century or 16th century, if you were an armourer, you might only make helmets or you might only make gauntlets. And indeed, there were mail, i.e. chainmail makers. But within weapons, even within there, you'd have divisions. So you wouldn't necessarily have a sword maker who made a complete sword. There were some examples of that throughout history, but equally in big workshops you would get someone who made blades, someone who made hilt fittings, someone who assembled the whole things together. Generally speaking, a blade maker would be a different person to a cutler, and who is usually someone who makes the hilts and puts the hilts together. In some cases, in medieval Europe, for example, people traded blades right the way across Europe, and then they were hilted locally. But let's get back to Game of Thrones. So Robert Baratheon was famous for using a great big Warhammer, and understandably the writer, George R.R. Martin, and the writers of the show, of course, bearing in mind that they're slightly different people and the show has diverged from the books in many minor details and some cases major details, they have decided to give Gendry, as the bastard son of Robert Baratheon, a Warhammer. Now, I wouldn't criticise this at all. I think it's great. It's a great idea. It ties it back. And also when we see Jon Snow interacting with Gendry, we're reminded of the friendship that was built up between Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon. So they're shadowing that friendship and reviving it as well. So now again, we see, what do we see? We see a Stark and a Baratheon going to war potentially with the Lannisters, although they might ally. But anyway, that's another topic. So we see that Gendry has a Warhammer. That's absolutely great. But Game of Thrones, the show, I won't say anything about the books here, Game of Thrones, the show, has fallen into a real fantasy kind of cliche, and that is that Warhammers must be massive. Now, what's the problem with a massive Warhammer? Well, we're going to examine this, but historically, the first thing to say is historically Warhammers tended to look like this. Not very big at all. It's bigger than most blacksmith's hammers, it's in terms of length at least, but it has, generally speaking, a lighter head. And why is that? Well, quite simply, if you're fighting with something, if you make a solid lump of steel and it's on the end of a stick, where is the point of balance on a Warhammer? It's there. On a sword, it's completely other end of the weapon. So one of the things about a sword, let's say a sword that weighs 2.5 pounds, it might only weigh the same as this Warhammer, but it can be much longer because you've got a thin piece of steel that is balanced close to the hand. Because it's balanced close to the hand, it means it's nimble and you can move it around quickly and without getting exhausted. Now, one of the things about fighting is some of you might be thinking, oh yeah, but when you hit someone with a hammer, you want to hit really, really hard. Well, That's true, but bear in mind this is a medieval type of world, okay? Many of you say, oh, Matt, this is fantasy. Yes, it is fantasy, but nevertheless, it's a medieval type of world, and it follows the same laws of physics that our world follows, dragons and magic aside. In terms of combat, it follows the same physics. And that means that, quite simply, you want a weapon, generally speaking, that you can't only do one heavy blow with. Because yes, you might kill person A, but then person B is going to kill you. Secondly, if you're fighting in armour, the number one hit is probably not going to put the person out of action. Or indeed, they might block it, or they might dodge it. And even if it hits them and they're wearing armour, it's not probably going to put them out of action with one blow. So the problem is that with any type of weapon, even a percussive weapon such as a warhammer or a mace or a flail or something like this, you're gonna want the ability to not only give repeated blows with the weapon, but also block with the weapon in numerous different ways. There's different ways you can block with weapons. If you're using a weapon alone, you might be blocking with two hands. If you're using a shield, of course, you'll be putting the shield in the way predominantly and only hitting with the weapon. But you still want the ability to keep operating that weapon. And famously, you know, single combats can last minutes, sometimes seconds, but sometimes minutes. And group combats, melees or skirmishes or larger scale battles can of course last many minutes or indeed hours. And of course, you know, we can't generalize about this. There are some battles that are over in 20 minutes, and there are some battles that last all day, like the Battle of Hastings in 1066, which was a famously long battle. And of course, that doesn't mean that people are fighting all the time during that battle. They're continuously engaging and then disengaging, maybe rearranging their forces, engaging, disengaging. So it's a series of actions, but nevertheless, you have to be able to use that weapon for a protracted amount of time. Therefore, percussion weapons, even weapons that hit with having a heavy lump at the end of a lever, they still need to be used nimbly and repeatedly, relatively speaking. Not as nimbly as a sword, but you still need to be able to move them around. We see the same thing with axes like the ones on the wall behind me. They don't have ginormous heads or thick heads. The general rule between a wood chopping axe and a fighting axe is that the fighting axe will have a thinner blade. So it might look bigger, but the total weight of a fighting axe is very often lower than, in fact, very usually lower than a wood chopping axe. Now, the issue that we see here is that Gendry's Warhammer is really quite massive by historical comparisons. It's large and rounded and thick, and it's just a great big cumbersome lump of metal, we presume steel, castle forged steel we would assume, on the end of a lever. And that is going to be a really, really cumbersome thing to handle. And in fact, we do see that Gendry moves it in a more or less cumbersome way. Now, of course, in terms of the actual show itself, this isn't going to be a lump of steel. I would imagine it's a lump of aluminium, which, of course, aluminium is considerably lighter than steel. And in fact, for decades, aluminium has been used as a substitute for steel in the movie industry because it enables you to churn out blades that are cheaper, perhaps, arguably more easily replaced, and they're lighter and easier to handle for TV and movie extras. But what this does lead to is the oversized weapon impression. And the thing is that we get this reinforced with things like Warhammer, the war game, and indeed we get it in fantasy art, and we've had it really going back all the way to probably it started in about the 1950s or 60s, and we even see it in things like Marvel's Thor with Thor's hammer, although we could argue in that case, yes, he's a god, he's a superhero, so it doesn't matter about how big his hammer is, but nevertheless in the public perception we've had reinforced this idea that warhammers and indeed battle axes must be huge, and quite simply they don't function very well if they're huge, because you can't use them nimbly as a weapon. Yes, you could potentially, if you were strong enough and built like Arnie at his peak, you could swing the weapon once, but the problem is a more nimble person, especially if you're not wearing armor or you're only wearing partial armor, a more nimble person can simply avoid that strike and then stab you with a lighter, sharper weapon. So as seen here, this is fairly typical. This is a replica Warhammer, and this is based on an example in London's Wallace collection. And in fact, there are other examples from around the world. This is fairly typical for the size and weight and sort of, proportions of what we would sometimes call a horseman's hammer. These weapons were usually used, at least these shorter ones, were usually used by men on horseback, and they were used to some degree to not neutralize but to overcome other armored opponents. So they're a specialized armored fighting weapon. The hammer face is usually used for general striking, and the beak, or the point at the back, it's known as bec in medieval French, is used to strike at gaps in armor. And there is some evidence, there's some from archaeology, we know some helmets which have a square hole through actual plates and through skulls. So sometimes it was used to strike directly into the armour, but generally speaking, you would use this hammer face like a mace, and notice it's got a projection on it here to help bite into the whatever it's striking, plate or gaps between plates, so that the force isn't diverted and deflected away. And the point is usually used to try and strike at gaps, and you can turn the weapon quite easily by virtue of the fact that they usually have rectangular or octagonal, is that a word? Octagonal shafts, sometimes hexagonal shafts, so that you can feel the edge alignment. It's not edge alignment, but you can index the weapon and tell that your weapon is pointing in the right direction, because of course if it's slightly slanted to the side, you're going to deflect, and not all of the energy from your blow is going to go into the target. So these were frequently used by people on horseback. Occasionally the short ones were used by people on foot, but people on foot more often used something of this sort of proportion. And when I hear about Robert Baratheon using a large Warhammer, I actually think of something more of these proportions. Not large in terms of the head being massive, but actually of the weapon being longer. So this is what's called a poleaxe. Now, poleaxe is a specialized weapon for fighting in armor against armor on foot. And of course, when you've got a weapon of this length, you're far more versatile in how you can use it. You've got longer reach, longer leverage, you've got a hammer on one side, and either a spike or an axe on the other side. This example is what we would call a poleaxe. There are some types we might call pole hammers, although historically they were often also called poleaxes, even when they didn't have an axe blade on. So very often we'll find a hammer face on one side and a spike on the other. This one just happens to have an axe. But if we're just looking at the hammer, because we're talking about Warhammers here, we generally have a coronet type arrangement or pyramidal projections, again so that it bites into the thing you're striking and you have less likelihood of the weapon sliding off. So indeed, I think Robert Baratheon would have been using something more like a poleaxe, and that's highly effective weapon against armor. Many of them have spikes at the top and spikes at the bottom, which you can use like a spear, or indeed if someone comes close, you can jab with the back as well. Obviously the shaft itself is a weapon. You can block all other weapons effectively with it. You can push away with the shaft, you can hit with the back, the top, hit with the edge, hit with the hammer as you like. So this is really what a big historical hammer looks like. What a big historical hammer does not look like is a sledgehammer. Now, this is actually closer to Gendry's Warhammer, isn't it? Would this make an effective weapon? Well, the first thing I'll have to say is I'm not one of those people who's going to say that Gendry's weapon absolutely could not be used as a weapon in real warfare. It could. And there is some historical precedent for large mallet-like objects like this being used in war. And that is, there are some references, or only a couple I think, of references to English archers in the 100 Years' War using mauls. Now, a maul is a large wooden mallet, which could be lead shod or iron shod to make it stronger or heavier. And it's essentially a bit like a sledgehammer. Now, a typical sledgehammer, at least here in the UK, usually weighs either 7 or 14 pounds. That's heavy. A poleaxe, usually at its heaviest, weighs about 7 pounds. Okay, so with a poleaxe, what you're getting is a much larger weapon with a lot more things you can do with it at both ends, in exchange for a weapon that's the same weight as the lightest type of sledgehammer. A sledgehammer, in contrast, is shorter, It doesn't have an awful lot of reach, except for kind of pommeling or hitting with the butt at very close range. You can't really do anything with the back end. You could have a top spike, and in fact we see Gendry's Warhammer does indeed have a top spike of sorts, although it doesn't look particularly long or pointy. But his weapon does look to be of a similar kind of mass and proportions to a sledgehammer. Now, could you fight with this thing? Well, normally people are swinging sledgehammers at things on the ground, and obviously letting gravity do the work for you is the easiest way to use something that's of this weight. But if you are going to swing, I'm getting out of breath just talking and swinging this thing at the same time. If you are really strong, and clearly I'm just a normal guy with a desk job, I am not Hafthor Bjornsson, or I am not, you know, kind of like, clearly I am not a bodybuilder or anything like that. But I do swing weapons around. I do teach people how to use weapons on a regular basis, and you do use different sets of muscles to move weapons around to those that, and indeed for things like manual labour, building, it develops a different type of functional strength very often to what people in the gym have. And there are ways of moving weapons around like this that involve efficiency. And indeed you can sort of swing a weapon of this weight around to some degree. So you could potentially, I'm not going to say it's impossible, you could potentially fight with a 7-pound hammer of the size of Gendry's Warhammer. But what it really comes down to is, would you want to? And I think that's the point. I think it always comes back to the fact that in history, Warhammers were either of a poleaxe size, if you wanted a long weapon for fighting on foot, or a shorter, smaller size for fighting on horseback. Sometimes you get ones with longer shafts, but equally small heads for fighting on horseback, incidentally. Some of you might think, don't you want a longer weapon for fighting on horseback? It depends who your opponents are. If you're mostly fighting other cavalry, then indeed a short weapon is good enough to reach them and is going to be more handy. If you're attacking infantry, you need a longer weapon in order to reach them from up on your warhorse. But I think we should always look at history for examples, and very often people in history who used weapons regularly developed the best designs of weapons for that context. And Game of Thrones is a medieval world, and they use warhammers and swords and spears and all the weapons that were used in our own medieval and Renaissance periods. And therefore warhammers in fantasy, not just Game of Thrones, but in all fantasy, for the most part, with some rare exceptions, should look like this. They should be relatively small-headed and relatively light and handy, and not really much heavier for the most part than swords of an equivalent size. The real only difference between these and swords is that these are balanced towards the head and swords are balanced towards the hand. But I do also want to reiterate that indeed you could theoretically fight with a weapon the size of Gendry's Warhammer, or indeed other Warhammers that we see in fantasy, within some parameters. Some of the Warhammer kind of dwarven hammers that we see are ridiculously huge, and unless you were so strong that you could kind of lift up a car, you probably couldn't fight with those. But this type of size hammer in the Game of Thrones world, could Gendry fight with this? Well, kind of, but he's going to have to be slipping the hand, as we would say, so a lot of the time he's going to be handling the hammer like this, so he's got one hand close to the point of balance, and then only letting that weight go out when he's really committed to a strike. So you'd have to fight with it in a very particular way, and actually the shaft would be as important, you could even argue more important, than the head itself. And you'd really have to kind of rein in that head and keep it in reserve for that final boom, for that coup de grace, for the final blow. So there we go, folks. I hope that was moderately interesting. I love Game of Thrones as much as many of you, I'm sure, and Warhammers are awesome. I love the fact that they've got Gendry using a Warhammer like his father did before him. Although I do wish they had made it look slightly more like a real historical Warhammer, rather than going down the fantasy cliche of having a huge freaking hammer that is clearly made of not steel. Cheers, folks. Just quickly to say, if you're not subscribed, then please click subscribe. I do love subscribers and I treat you incredibly well and I make lovely videos. I also have a Patreon where I release extra videos, extra content for people who want to pledge $1 or however much per video. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. I'll put links below to all of those things and hopefully see you again soon. Bye. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.